Today, Shell's global profits skyrocket. Should they pay more tax? How do you root bad apples out of the police force? And why have Welsh rugby fans been asked to stop singing Delilah? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Matt Warman, Labour Police and Crime Commissioner Kim McGuinness, political reporter Nadine Batchelor-Hunt and GB News political correspondent Tom Harwood. Today, oil and gas company Shell announces it made nearly $40 billion last year. Will forcing them to pay more tax help you pay your energy bills?
The government is still refusing to close loopholes in the windfall tax that will allow these big energy companies to keep more of their profits while people across every part of our country are struggling to heat their homes.
And there's been anger in Matt Warman's constituency, Boston and Skegness, where local hotels are being used to house asylum seekers.
We can't accommodate them. So I would like to know, even if you have to publicly announce it, exactly when they're going to be gone.
We'll hear from one hotel owner who says it's hitting his business. But with asylum applications soaring, what can the government do about it?
We haven't applied the same sense of ruthlessness to guarding our own integrity that we routinely apply to confronting criminals, and I'm deeply sorry for that.
And how do you stop the wrong people from becoming police officers? Let's start with this headline in The Guardian. Bye, Delilah. Wales rugby choirs banned from singing Tom Jones' hit. Let's just remind you of the song.
I saw the light on the night that I passed by her window.
So, yes, that classic from Tom Jones, it's been taken off the playlist. In fact, it's been banned from choirs singing it at the National Stadium because some of the lyrics have been deemed misogynist and promoting violence against women. They describe the protagonist stabbing his girlfriend after her finding another man. So my question to you to start the programme, Matt Warman, is it the right decision by the Welsh Rugby Union?
I think it's not the biggest problem that the Welsh Rugby Union face, if I'm honest, but they took some action against this song in 2015. This is a further step on that road. I think these are not the sort of lyrics that any of us would really like to be singing, but as I say, it can't be the biggest problem that the Welsh Rugby Union faces because they've got a lot more issues that they've been talking about recently around misogyny and around the environment on the pitch and off it.
Do you think it's an important issue? Do you think they've made the right decision, Kim?
I think, to be honest with you, the Welsh rugby fans will probably sing it anyway, and I think that's the reality. And I think we need to look at the findings of the report into Welsh rugby about misogyny and sexist behaviour, about the things that people are really experiencing, and they need to take a long, hard look at how they tackle those really proper issues rather than it only just being about tokenistic things. So, yes.
Oh, so you think it is tokenistic? You don't think it's an important message?
I think, yes, bang the song, but you need to do more than that.
Let's have a look at the statement from Welsh Rugby Union. The WRU condemns domestic violence of any kind. We have previously sought advice from subject matter experts on the issue of censoring the song, and we are respectfully aware that it is problematic and upsetting to some supporters because of its subject matter. It is an iconic song. It's something of an anthem for Welsh rugby fans. Do you think it's the right move?
So I don't actually watch rugby, so I didn't really know that this was the national anthem, and I think when before I came on the show and I read about it, it does seem to be quite an extreme lyric. And I do think it's one of these anachronisms that have kind of survived that eventually will be phased out. I think whenever something like this happens, if it's a song, people are like, oh, but it's, it's PR, political correctness gone mad. But I think it's just inevitable. A song talking about stabbing a woman, then we're eventually going to censor that and say, I don't think that's appropriate anymore.
I had no idea that the lyrics were about stabbing a woman. I don't think many people had any idea that this is what the lyrics were about.
Well, shall I read you that line?
I mean,
yes. I mean, I didn't know either, actually, to be honest. But it says, she stood there laughing and I felt the knife in my hand and she laughed no more.
Right, and I mean, you could interpret that in a number of ways, I suppose, but clearly it's about a knife, it's about a woman. Maybe it's not the best message to put across, but I wonder how far are we going to go with all of this stuff when we're talking about censorship of art. It sort of makes me think that there is this sort of odd sort of political correctness that has, in many ways, it's the other half of the coin to the people that want to ban the Sam Smith music video, or that say that video games cause violence. I mean, how far are we going to go? How far are we going to actually sort of look at stuff like this and see that it actually impacts the real world? Does it really? I'm not so sure.
I feel like it's always inevitable with this stuff, though. Like, whenever we have a change like this, there will always be people like, oh, it's political correctness gone mad. But then, in 10 years' time, everyone's like, wow, actually, that made a lot of sense. So I feel like, as I say, I think it's a bit of an anachronism.
We're not banning it. This isn't the government saying that you can't.
No.
This is the Welsh Rugby Union saying they don't want to be associated with it. That seems to me like the right call for them and the right balance for the government.
But where do you draw the line?
Well, I think that the Welsh fans are certainly not singing it because of that, are they? The Welsh fans are singing it because they're Welsh fans, and Tom Jones is an iconic Welsh singer.
Yeah.
And that's where... And what this will probably do is inform a lot of people that it was about stabbing a woman, which they probably didn't realise before.
Does that do more harm, though?
Well,
does telling everyone that this song that they love is actually a horrible song? I mean, wouldn't it be better if sort of we lived in a bit of blissful ignorance about it?
I tend to agree with Nadine that it's natural that it'll be phased out. But my point is, and we can't really get distracted by the song, if there are issues in Welsh rugby about sexism and misogyny, that's what they've got to deal with. They've got to look inside themselves and think, how are we solving this problem, and how are we supporting our fans in solving this problem? How are we making our games safer to attend? All
right, let's have a look at this headline in the Financial Times. You heard again at the start of the programme, Shell profits more than double to record $40 billion. Let's talk about this with our business editor, Simon Jack. Hello to you, Simon. Can you give us a bit of context to these figures? People will be thinking, oh, surely they're paying millions, hundreds of millions in tax.
Two things. It's the highest profit in their 115-year history. It is, by my reckoning, the highest profit ever recorded by any UK company. And obviously it's because of soaring oil and gas prices. They were already rising last year. They started soaring when Russia invaded Ukraine, shutting off oil and gas supplies from Russia. Now, as far as the tax goes, they paid £100 million in UK tax in 2022. They say they're going to pay £400 million in tax in 2023. And people will say, well, that's peanuts compared to the profits they're making. A couple of things to bear in mind. 95% of their profits are made and taxed elsewhere, outside the UK. They do very little business here, actually, in these shores and waters. And secondly, they are allowed to offset, quite legally, decommissioning costs from taking apart old oil rigs and investing in more oil and gas resources in the UK against those profits. So they don't do much here, and what they do, they can offset some investments here. So that's why the number will be small. Not big enough, I imagine, to stop people complaining that they are not paying nearly enough tax. Another thing I think people will notice is they paid more in share buybacks and dividends, giving money to their shareholders, than they did in renewable projects. That, I think, they'll come under a lot of pressure for.
What was the figure in terms of dividends?
£5 billion in dividends and share buybacks, and they're saying they're going to do the same again next year. Now, some of those dividends and some of that money going out to shareholders will go to pension funds. If you have a pension, the chances are you own some shares in Shell. It's one of the biggest listed companies in the FTSE 100. Some people have divested out of fossil fuels, but pension funds do still rely on these jumbo dividends to help pay out their pension liabilities.
Just to bring our audience the news in the last few minutes or so, the interest rates have gone up. That was expected. They've gone up for the 10th month in a row by 0.5%. They are now at 4%. What is that going to mean for people with mortgages and households or credit card loans?
Well, it's good news for savers. We shouldn't forget about them. There are as many savers as borrowers, more in fact. And for people who are coming off fixed-rate mortgages, and there's 1.8 million of those in the country, they will be looking at slightly higher mortgage bills. Although I don't think today's rate rise will make much difference, because most lenders had already factored this into their calculations. Much more interesting, I think, is the fact that the bank said two things. It said this might be it They were expected to go up to 4.5%, even 5%, 6% during the Truss administration. This could be, or very nearly, it for rate rises. The bank also said there would be a recession this year in 2023, but it would be shorter and milder than thought. They also scaled down where they thought unemployment would get to, but they said there are still some labour market pressures because not enough people have returned to the workforce after COVID, whether they're in their over 50s, etc., in touching distance of their final salary pension scheme. But generally, pretty good news to the Bank of England. Yes, recession possibly in 2023, but shorter and less severe than previously thought.
Simon Jack, thank you very much. Are you celebrating, Matt, Shell's record profits?
No, I don't think anyone's celebrating these record profits. They are good news in some senses. Obviously, for pension funds, obviously companies doing well in principle is a really good thing. But the manner in which Shell is making these profits are through circumstances that no one would have wished on anybody. I think that's part of the reason why you've already got a windfall tax from the UK government that's been increased by Jeremy Hunt.
You were under a lot of pressure to do that, though, weren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that's because it was the right thing to do. The fact that Jeremy Hunt did it is the right thing. If more of these profits were being made in the UK, or there wasn't that incentive to invest in renewables, then I think lots more people across the political spectrum would be saying go further.
What was your reaction when you heard the record profits?
Well, I just think that we really need to look at putting a proper windfall tax in, removing those tax breaks, going more in line with where we are in Europe. I tend to agree with Lisa Nandy on that. We heard her speaking about it.
She was there in the headlines.
Yeah, and I think the fact that, yes, incentives to invest in green energy, but less money spent on green energy than paid in dividends, that will be alarming to a lot of people who are really struggling to heat their homes and who are looking at that cap on energy bills ending in April.
Right, when you say a proper, I think you said, windfall tax, I think it's at 75%, the extended windfall tax brought in by the government. What more would you like to see?
Labour is saying that we need to bring this more in line with what's happening in Europe, and we need to be taking away those tax breaks that they're taking advantage of. And this is not anything that these companies aren't expecting. It's nothing that these companies weren't expecting to post these profits, and I think they expect to pay proper tax.
Well, do you agree with that?
Well, I think you are seeing some of the big energy companies adjusting how much they end up spending on renewables, how much they end up investing as a result of paying higher taxes. So it's a balance, and what I think the government should be doing is trying to extract the maximum possible investment into renewables, into making our energy supply more secure, as well as going as far as they reasonably can on the windfall tax.
Kim, is that enough?
No, as I said, I think we need to look at these tax breaks that they're still taking advantage of and take them away. I mean, I think most people want to see their energy bills come down, and this is how we're going to pay for it.
I mean, there is a problem, isn't there, Tom? You hear $40 billion. I accept Simon Jack's point that 95% of it is outside the UK, at a time, though, when households here are continuing to face soaring energy bills, and the rate of tax or the level or the amount just doesn't feel big enough.
But isn't that the problem? That only 5% of these profits are being made in the UK? That's only £2 billion out of £40 billion. Why are only £5 billion of these profits being made or 5% of these profits being made in the UK? Well, could it be that we've slapped a 75% tax on these companies? One of the highest windfall taxes in the world. It's on top of a 30% corporation tax, which has a 10% supplementary, then had a 25% windfall on that then got extended to a 35% windfall, making 3/4 of that profit taxed. Is it any wonder that they're not doing as much business in this country, and 95% of their business is elsewhere, making tax revenue for other countries, tax revenue for Canada, for the United States, for Indonesia, for Argentina? These are their big markets. We're not a big market for them because we're taxing them to the hilt.
Nadine?
I think ultimately this comes down to an ideological argument about how we supply energy. This is how the free market works. Energy was privatised. This is inevitably how it is, because these companies operate for profit. If the public are dissatisfied with the way that this works, BP and these oil companies, Shell, they're more than entitled to make these huge profits. If we want to have an energy system in this country where people feel like they're getting value for money, they feel like the profits are being reinvested into infrastructure, into the public, and they don't feel like they're being exploited, then we need to look at the way in which we manage our energy supply. And I think this has been something that has come up time and time and again. I think it's obviously ideologically difficult, particularly for somebody like Rishi Sunak, who is kind of a kind of student of Thatcher. But again, you know, Labour's also bringing in, thinking of, you know, if they get in power, to start Great British Energy, of this kind of producing energy at home and not exporting it abroad. So I just wonder if ideologically people are shifting back towards maybe nationalised energy and, you know, supplying energy for ourselves and not allowing this money to go elsewhere is better.
Are you out of touch on this, Matt?
Well, I think there is obviously a huge shift towards the importance of energy security. We've seen that. Great British Energy from Labour is to some extent a response to that. The government has a different approach but is trying to tackle the same problem. I think the idea, though, that as Nadine sort of hints that we should be nationalising this company is not practical. These are global businesses that simply would say, well, as Tom says, we're going to be doing less in the UK. So I think you can have ideological arguments, but sometimes they meet reality and you have to adjust accordingly.
Right. I mean, Labour's response was at one point to look at nationalising it, but no longer.
No, I think, well, Keir Starmer said that if we're in power, we'll establish Great British Energy, which is...
It's not quite the same as, you know, completely dismantling the energy market, is it?
No, but we need to be making more of our own energy in this country, and well, you know, and that's what we need to be doing. And I think kind of the argument that Shell makes so little profit, pays so little tax because it makes so little profit here. I think if we go back 2 years, they didn't pay any tax in the UK, and so clearly that doesn't necessarily stack, and that's not acceptable to the British people, particularly when their bills are so high. And I think often what we need to bring this back down to is the household level. What are people experiencing in their homes day to day? And far too many of my residents.
And does that mean that they will be doing what Nadine said, the cultural change away from this sort of...
I'd like to ask Nadine if Labour supports extending new oil and gas licences for Shell so they can do more drilling in the North Sea, so that they can create more tax revenues that can go to HMRC, that can fund the public services in this country. Is that something that the Labour Party would support?
We've got to move away from fossil fuels. We are far too reliant on it, and that is part of why we're in the financial situation that we're in.
But there is also a separate question around the idea that a windfall tax is going to make the government's support for energy bills unnecessary is simply bad maths. The vast majority of support has come from central government. It will continue to come from central government. A windfall tax may well be a small part of that solution, but it is never going to be the whole thing, and that's because these are global challenges.
Nadine?
As I said, I think it all goes back to, you know, where the public are when it comes to the production of energy, and I think, you know, we've seen a lot of this kind of, you know, over the last few years about making things British, producing our own things, being self-sustainable. And I think this is why Labour's approach on energy, I think, will be appealing to the public, because it's the idea of being in control of the energy that we produce here and having that level of autonomy over it. So I do just think we're having a bit of a crisis here of how do we produce our energy and how do we want to and how do we want those profits to be used.
Well, and part of that crisis may be what you alluded to earlier, all of you. The Daily Telegraph headline says BP to cut back on green shift amid booming demand for fossil fuels. Again, it's this idea, Tom, that companies are exploiting to some extent so much of the sort of outfall of the Ukraine war. How does that look to people watching, that they are going to focus more on fossil fuels while it's going to bring them a great return?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting situation that, of course, is a harrowing one, and the obvious solution to all of this is to get a quick end to that war in Ukraine that I think everyone wants to see. And I think most people will be sitting back and thinking about the British government and how well it's done in terms of spurring the international coalition to provide tanks to Ukraine, but also raise an eyebrow as to why the UK government is not providing jets to Ukraine, which they've asked for. And I think that there are some big questions over that issue. At the moment, the government's line, which it seems to be an incredibly feeble one, is saying that these jets are too complicated for the Ukrainian army to use. This is an army that's held back, an army that's far larger and has been planning this invasion for a long time. Are we seriously, as Britain, saying that the Ukrainians can't use our equipment? Well, it's a really big question for the government.
That's a bit of a tangent to go off on when it comes to talking about, you know, profits and the way in which energy companies are operating. Like, you are right, the end of the war in Ukraine will, you know, provide some relief. but ultimately this is about business practices. You know, if there were any other global crisis that has affected oil prices, they probably would have done the same thing. But again, this comes down to ideology and free markets. They are more than entitled
what about
to...
the energy market in the UK is free?
No, but the way in which companies operate, they're more than entitled to send their money to shareholders. They're more than entitled to exploit. They're not regulated as they would be if they were nationalised. But that's how it works.
Can we please remember exactly what was going on over the summer when this country was dashing around the world, going to places like Qatar and the UAE and trying to get extra gas exports to this country, because otherwise we're facing a big problem. We've been buying huge amounts of gas exports from the United States as well. So doesn't it make sense, therefore, that these companies want to produce more of that stuff because the international price is so high? That's how the market works.
Well, that's the point, though.
What's your opposite solution? That we just sit back and allow these very high prices to be subsidised by pretend money for evermore?
Well, but the government wants them to make... Yes, the government wants them to make a transition, though, to more investment into renewables, but they won't, will they? Why they can make so much money out of fossil fuels?
We are seeing a huge shift globally towards more renewable energy, but it is always going to be a transitional period, and we can't, as Tom sort of says, we can't wish away the fact that there is huge necessity globally for fossil fuels at the moment.
Right, a question now just come out, in fact I can put to both of you, Kim and Matt, is that Andrew Bailey, head of the Bank of England, the governor there, has said inflation has turned a corner. Are your constituents feeling that?
I think the answer is not yet,
No.
but I do think people have, if I measure it by my own inbox, then there is a plateauing of people talking about that as a particular issue. That would reflect where we are. But this is the most important issue facing Jo and Joanna public right now, inflation.
Right. Your response?
Yeah, I don't think that the public are feeling like inflation is going in the right direction yet. I think there's a long way to go. And actually, I would really like to see government being a lot more ambitious. I think Rishi Sunak said he would halve inflation. That's less ambitious than the Bank of England themselves, who think it should be around 2%. And so we need to be supporting the public where they're really struggling with rising costs. And I think the thing that we have to remember, certainly for a lot of my constituents, you know, I represent the area in the country that has the highest level of child poverty. There's a lot of people who are feeling the pinch of rising costs and who were struggling before we got here. And so, you know, turning that round for them takes more than dealing with inflation. It takes dealing with the pound in their pocket more broadly.
All right, let's move on. We're going to show you some pictures of the community meeting we saw in the headlines earlier. It's a meeting in Skegness, in your constituency, where local people were voicing their frustration over the use of hotels to house asylum seekers in the area. Matt Warman was answering questions, came under some pressure from local residents unhappy about the issue. Let's take a look.
Very quick at telling us what he can't do, but he hasn't told us what he can do.
Most people just want to know when it's going to stop. I'm not being funny. The book's got to stop somewhere. If he's already going to the top, asking these questions and getting nowhere, change your question.
Now, the Home Office has been using hotels across the UK as temporary and emergency accommodation for asylum seekers. A spokesman earlier this week said that there are currently more than 45,500 asylum seekers in hotels, costing the taxpayer £5.6 million a day. Now, it's not just in Skegness. Eastbourne Borough Council has complained to the Home Office about the use of 6 hotels in the area, as have Ipswich Borough Council and East Riding of Yorkshire Council. They, in fact, failed in a legal attempt to block the use of 2 large hotels from being converted to house asylum seekers. Let's talk to a hotelier in Skegness. He knows Matt Warman. Nigel Underwood, welcome to you. Why is this an issue?
Well, it's a big issue for several reasons. Firstly, and the instant problem we have is the reputational harm that's done to the town. People are now ringing up for, rather than asking for a room, the first question they ask is, are you housing asylum seekers? Are asylum seekers near your hotel? Then they ask for a room. So it's a big problem to the town. Going, you know, in the future, we're going to lose 185 bedrooms that are all in prime locations on the seafront, which will not have holidaymakers in there spending their money in the town at the bars, restaurants, attractions, fun fairs and everything else. So this could sort of take a big hole out of the market this coming year, which is going to take quite a while to repair.
we've heard some reaction from local residents. Would you feel that was representative of people in the local area in terms of the impact on the community?
Oh, I think so. It's stretching the community cohesion, really. We've got sort of 229 young males with nothing to do, sort of injected into a town of less than 20,000 people.
Right.
And it's straining the infrastructure.
Right, but what about the money that's being made by the hotels that are housing asylum seekers? They're doing rather well, aren't they?
They are. I mean, we're post-pandemic. A lot of these hotels have been struggling. I'm well established. I've got 46 bedrooms and I've been here 35 years. But a lot of them are sort of short-term. They've been bought cheap by absentee landlords with a government business plan that makes them, well, they can finance the hotel in probably 2 to 3 years of the purchase.
All right, but they are making money. We've got Matt Warman here. You know him. What would you like to say to him? What would you want him to do?
I think it'd be topical to say why Skegness, but perhaps we're not allowed to say that. I'd like Matt to sort of see if we can rehouse some of the asylum seekers in other areas. We had probably about 50 or 60 through the last season. It wasn't a problem. It wasn't noticeable. But for the future, 229 taking 185 bedrooms off the seafront. It's a big hole to the town's economy.
All right, well, Matt, what are you going to do?
Well, I mean, Nigel and I agree on this completely. I think my challenge here has to be to say, how can the Home Office deliver on what it says its policy is, which is to stop the use of hotels and to process people much faster, and to put those people who are in need of accommodation in large, let's say, disused military bases, that kind of thing, where they can get focused resources and where they're not changing the nature of communities where the infrastructure is already stretched.
Right, but I mean, there'll be people who say, this is your government, of course, this is their policy, they've decided to do this. Why not in Boston and Skegness? Why in other parts of the country?
Well, I think it's not, this isn't the government's first choice by any means. This is a function of...
a failure of the government.
Well, it's a function of more people arriving and a system that is, by the Home Secretary's own admission and the Prime Minister's own admission, going too slowly when it comes to processing those applications. So, for me, the government has to deliver on what it says its policy is, which is housing people in the right places, not in hotels, and processing their applications quickly, as well, of course, as having a functioning system that means that people aren't ultimately making these incredibly perilous journeys across the channel in small boats anyway.
I mean, we're talking about the people who are here, but you don't want to return to detention centres, I presume.
No, of course.
Right.
But the legal requirement is for decent but not luxurious accommodation for people while their claims are assessed. Now, hotels are not the right place for that. They are only being used because the government has not been able to provide preferable locations for them to live yet.
It's important, though, to remember that if you're trying to raise a family with children, a hotel is not a luxurious environment. You know, you don't really have a place to study. The children don't have a quiet place to work. You don't have a kitchen. You're all living in a tiny room. So I think it's important to remember that, you know, the word hotel, in the long term, would any of us want to live in a hotel room with children indefinitely? I think we have to be really careful with that language. And I think one of the things that I take issue with is, why would somebody, when going on holiday, have an issue if there were asylum seekers nearby or in the hotel? We have to have an honest conversation about why that is. There will be some people that have legitimate concerns for various reasons, but there will also be people that have issues with asylum seekers, and we have to be honest about that.
Right, well, let me let Nigel respond to that. Nigel, you heard that question there from Nadine. Why? Why do people have a problem?
I think a vast majority of the population, if we're honest, are quite xenophobic.
Well,
and that's, I think, a conversation that we honestly need to have. I think that is part of it. You know, I completely agree that there are some communities that cannot deal with an influx in the population.
In the numbers terms.
Yeah, we've had, 10 years of austerity. Many public services are overstretched. We've seen it with schools. There aren't enough teachers. We've seen it with doctors' surgeries, etc. So there are a lot of public services, and places like, Skegness, places that have been traditionally underinvested in, completely legitimate concerns about an influx of people. But there is xenophobia that plays a role in this.
Yeah, and should we be honest about that then, Tom?
I don't think that the United Kingdom is a xenophobic country.
No, but there may be xenophobia
I'm sure there are some xenophobic people in the United Kingdom, but I don't think this country. But I don't think this country is, and I think that overwhelmingly we've seen an enormous amount of generosity of spirit towards, for example, the Ukrainians that have come to the United Kingdom, the over 100,000 people from Hong Kong who've now made their lives here fleeing communist tyranny. There are people from all over the world who have made their way to the United Kingdom under legal means, and that should be celebrated. The big issue is when people come here illegally. And that's the big problem that I think people are nervous about, because why should someone come here illegally? Why couldn't they come legally?
Seekers.
And so part
you're
of the solution
automatically
here...
assuming that some of these people in these hotels haven't had legitimate claims approved, or aren't legitimate
none of them have had their claims assessed or approved, and that's the big issue, because you just don't know who these people are. Which is why one of the big things that the government should be doing in its two-pronged approach, as it announced with the Nationality and Borders Bill, it was supposed to be both cracking down on the illegal gangs, but also looking at what legal routes could be opened so that people can be assessed, perhaps even before they come to the country.
Clear that they don't want to do
that does need to be part of the solution.
But Suella Braverman has made it clear she wants to bring down immigration, and she has no intention of creating more safe and legal routes. This has been raised by her own MPs.
The Nationality and Borders Bill did explicitly say that new legal routes need to be created. They haven't been yet. No. Part of the solution is creating
But how
those.
can there be if Suella Braverman saying that she wants to reduce immigration? She's not going to increase asylum safe and legal routes, and she's made it clear in the past with her rhetoric. That's not something that she's going to consider.
The Prime Minister, actually, when it comes to migration, has been saying he wants to deal with the boats before we get to issues of numbers of legal migrants.
Yes.
So actually dealing with the boats is the big priority, because people...
I know. Well, let's bring it back to the community, because I want to know from Kim, what would Labour do differently? Would you stop asylum seekers being housed in hotels?
I mean, not want to represent Matt's constituents here, but I think actually the legal versus illegal routes, though it is a massive issue and it needs dealing with, are not what Nigel's...
No, well, let's concentrate on what Nigel's talking about.
Every single asylum seeker that's housed in a hotel, it is a failing. We need to be better at this. We need to be bringing down the amount of time that it takes to process asylum claims so that people can either get on with their lives, get proper accommodation.
But here and now, if you had to deal with Nigel tomorrow and his problem with his hotel as he sees it, what would you do? What would you do if you were in Matt Warman's constituency? What would you say to people?
Well, we need to be working to very much quicker bring down the amount of time it takes to process those claims. The Tories have completely failed on this. I think it's taking something like 500 days to process a claim for an adult, 400 days for a child, or vice versa. It's far too long, and that leaves people in these hotels for too long. They can't work, which they should. So many of them should be able to. Many of them have got skills, which, Nigel says that these are people who have nothing to do. Why are we not allowing them to enter the workforce? And yes, we need much better accommodation. And I think the other thing that we haven't talked about is, Nigel's rightly asking why Skegness. There are huge numbers of local authorities around this country who are refusing to take people, who are refusing to take asylum seekers, and we need to be looking at that, because, entirely focusing this on our deprived coastal communities, northern communities, it doesn't work.
Well, Matt, have you failed in your bid to persuade the government to stop doing this?
Well, I think... obviously, there are asylum seekers living in Skegness. That is a reflection of trying to share the burden around the country. And as Nigel said, when there are relatively small numbers, people don't have anywhere near as much of an issue with it. So I think this is about fairness, and there is an issue of making sure that they are spread fairly around the country. I think that it is important to recognise, though, that where Nadine talks about are they families? They're not. These are universally single men. People feel uncomfortable about booking a hotel room because they're living next door to a hostel rather than to another hotel. It's a different environment. This isn't. I think it's lazy and dangerous to say this is just xenophobia and these are all families. They're simply not. We have to look at the reality of these situations.
Just because someone's male, though, and they're an asylum seeker, doesn't mean we should delegitimise the reasons they've come here. And I think that's a problem as well. That often we kind of look at, often they are Muslim men as well, and they often are looked at as, well, we don't want them here, they're dangerous. And there is an element of xenophobia to that. And I think we do need to have an honest conversation about the way in which we perceive these people. Again, as I said, there are legitimate concerns about infrastructure, but we cannot ignore that there will be a xenophobic aspect to this. And I'm not saying that the country is xenophobic overall, but I'm saying that that will be partially a factor. And I think, and then the last thing I'll add, obviously Skegness voted heavily for Brexit, and I think that's also probably a concern in the constituency. They wanted to reduce immigration, so there will be an element of that too. But I think we have to have a kind of holistic and comprehensive approach to be honest with ourselves about what is driving this.
I mean, Nigel, one of the questions that was posed by you and actually some of the people we saw earlier on from the meeting is when? When will it be dealt with? Is that the overriding concern? A bit of certainty?
Yes, we'd love some certainty. So we are looking at this summer with less probably 200 bedrooms less for holidaymakers to use. We're a family popular seaside resort, and it just doesn't sit well. It's very obvious, and the hotels are sort of being run by absentee landlords, and they're just slowly, shall we say, aesthetically going downhill.
All right, well, let's hear from Matt. When?
Well, so to take the precise example, 2 of the hotels in Skegness are supposedly temporary hotels where the bookings
temporary.
Where the bookings will end within a couple of months. Others are taken longer term. My question to Suella Braverman and to the Prime Minister has been to say, look, we have to deliver on those commitments to people, because otherwise you further crash faith in the government when you start to say, well, we said it was temporary and now it's becoming permanent, for instance.
Nigel, thank you very much for joining us. Nigel Underwood there, hotelier in Boston and Skegness. Let me just show you this headline in The Times. Met asks officers with misconduct records to come back. Now, this is a story reporting that the Metropolitan Police has sent out letters and invited more than 250 retired officers who have previous misconduct records to return because of their valuable skills and experience. This sits alongside the looming deadline of Boris Johnson 2019 manifesto pledge of hiring 20,000 more police officers by the end of this March. As you know, there have been high-profile cases of gross misconduct amongst certain police officers, including the recent David Carrick case. Kim, you, first of all, would you be happy to recruit somebody who in their past, a retired police officer, who at one point or some point had a misconduct claim on their record?
No.
No.
I just think that we have got to be looking at the confidence that people have in the police. I think we have to be honest and say it out loud, particularly women have in the police. And no, I do not think that this is a good way forward, but this 20,000 promise that the government has made is driving absolutely everything. And even then, you know, in the north, for example, in my area, we lost 1,100 police officers through the years of austerity. We're only going to be allowed to recruit 600 back. And in some areas, such as Essex in the south, they're saying they've got more than ever before. So this is creating a cacophony of problems. But no, I would not be happy with that at all.
I mean, but what's your response to that story, that there may be retired police officers coming back into forces with some sort of misconduct, maybe small, but maybe not?
Well, I think this is specifically about the Met, and it doesn't seem to me to be the right way forward at all, especially when the government is recruiting large numbers of new officers. We should be applying the highest possible standards to those new recruits. And actually, that 20,000 pledge reflects the fact that it's a 20,000 growth overall. So there have been 25,000 officers simply to replace the ones that were naturally retiring. So there's been a big turnover in police officers individually. That is an opportunity, I hope, to root out some of the people that various commissioners have talked about as being a real problem for the Met in particular.
Right, well, rooting out these people, how do you stop recruiting them in the first place, Kim?
Well, I think you do have to make sure that you've got really stringent recruitment processes in place. We've got to look at things like vetting. We need police forces to talk to each other. These are things that actually the public very much expect of us.
Right. People will be surprised that that doesn't happen already, but I take your point.
I mean, black people won't be surprised. I mean, black people have been saying for a while that there are issues with the police, and, you know, rightfully so, the misogyny aspect has had a light shone on it, but as I say, I've got a family member who was beaten up by the police, and they lied about him, and they were actually interviewed under caution and had to give a payout. Now, these police officers, I don't think they were fired. They're still out there. These are systemic issues, and I think they don't just affect women, they affect black people, and I think we do need to be listening to these concerns and recognising that arbitrary targets, like 20,000 police officers, and setting yourself a deadline, whether or not you've got the calibre of candidates or not, is dangerous. It's a danger to the public.
Right. I mean, we don't know the details of many of the cases that have come forward. Some we do. How would you, or what would you do to the recruitment process, Nadine, in order to try and minimise the risk of bad apples coming in?
There needs to be a longer process of vetting police officers and training, I think. It needs to be, I personally believe at least 2 years, spending time with police officers, working out who they are, working out what their behaviour is like in a context of education. I don't think there's enough education of police officers. And I think once you start teaching somebody, you learn more about that person as well and whether or not they're suitable. I don't think the process we have at the moment is long enough to make a judgment on whether this community can keep us safe.
It takes 2 to 3 years to train a police officer, and a lot of that is now done in the university environment. And so actually a lot of that is what we're seeing with our new recruits. And I think it does have to be about that vetting process. It does have to be about, I think, sometimes really good human contact before they arrive on day one. And I think the other thing that we have to say, and I totally agree, I think the people who are the most worried about headlines like this are black people, are women. And that is something that we have to look at. We can say that we have confidence that the vast majority of our police do a fantastic job, but we can also say that we need culture change at the same time, and that's where we've got to be heading. And this is certainly not something that I've had a conversation with the Home Secretary about. We're asking these questions locally, but we need to know what government will do to help with this.
But people do want to see more police officers, not just government, but people in the communities want to see more police officers. So there is this tension between the speed with which you recruit. Is there an issue, though, Tom, that sometimes the wrong uns are attracted to going into something like the police force because of the power that is bestowed upon them?
Yeah, it's the kind of people who are like library monitors at school, isn't it? It's the people that wanted to sort of stand over the water fountains and tell people what to do. It's the people who become politicians. It's
library monitors would be a bit unhappy with that comparison.
Perhaps.
I mean, you've ticked 2 of my boxes, and I don't think I'm a wrong one.
Maybe I'm being too facetious for the subject, but no, I think there is a point there that clearly there is a certain personality type that is attracted to a role of authority, and there's got to be a way to deal with that. But I think that ultimately, where the police is today seems a million miles away from where it was in the 1970s and the 1980s. I think we would be remiss in this conversation to ignore the strides that have been made and the culture in the police that has improved. And it might not be exactly where we want it to be today, but I think in order to understand how to make it better, we do have to understand how it has been improving in recent years.
I think the fact is, and it's an uncomfortable fact, but it is true, that predators will seek places to prey. And I think that's what you're trying to say. And it is our job to spot them on the way in and to stop them joining the police. And actually, it's interesting that you say that it's a certain personality type who are attracted to roles of authority. I actually think, and I stand in front of every single room full of new recruits in Northumbria, I actually think that a lot of these people join because they're very caring people. The job has changed very, very much. But the other thing is that there will be in existence already in police forces people that shouldn't be there.
Right.
And at that point, we need to make it so that people feel, police officers and staff feel like they can report their colleagues, that they can talk about these problems.
And the action will be taken. I'm sorry to interrupt because we haven't got that much time, but on that point, Lord Hogan Howe, former Met Police Commissioner, was up in the House of Lords talking about this issue, that it's actually quite difficult to get rid of police officers even if they have committed offences. Let's just have a listen.
One of the things that over the last 15 years I've become convinced of is that the office of constable is more a bar to excluding the bad than it is to protecting the good. What it means is that their employment rights are protected by secondary legislation, which includes the ability of lawyers in the employment tribunal process within the police, and also establishes actually it's Home Office guidance that says it's not just the balance of probabilities, but when dismissing an officer, it should travel towards beyond reasonable doubt. I think both of those measures do not help get rid of the difficult officers that Lord Lexton mentioned and Sir Mark has also mentioned. Both of these things should change.
Do you agree with that? You're all nodding away.
Yeah, I
Absolutely, and Mark Rowley, the Met Police Commissioner, has said, I think, pretty much the same thing as well. There's universal agreement on this. I think the Home Secretary is committed to looking at it. It can't come soon enough. I think you're entirely right as well when you say that there are bad apples already there, and these people create the structures. You know, when new recruits come in and they see an ethos and an environment where things are tolerated. So there does almost need to be some sort of review of people as well, like regular reviews.
Well, I think that's
and regular
going on, I think, in the Met Police.
Yeah, so and this is, I think, this is what we need. We need structural change, a structural change to the vetting and policing of the police.
Do you think there is also a danger of people arriving, they may be very good, and then they become corrupted a little bit by the system?
Well, I think if you're entering into a culture where you feel the need to fit in, and, you know, if you're the only person in the room saying that's wrong and everyone has a go at you, you're not going to want to raise concerns.
That's all we have time for today. Sorry, Tom, I know you wanted to come in. I will be back tomorrow with Politics UK at 12:15 here on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. Bye-bye.